Roughly 80 years after the Roman Empire crucified Jesus, a Roman governor named Pliny the Younger wrote a letter to the Roman emperor about a rapidly spreading problem in his district. And this problem meant that the pagan temples were virtually empty. The problem was that people everywhere, in the cities and in the country, were becoming Christians. Pliny had been interrogating and torturing people accused of being Christians, and he was trying to get to the bottom of what was happening. Those who confessed to being Christians, he threatened with punishment, and he forced them to prove that they had repented by cursing Jesus, which Pliny had heard no real Christian could do. And he made them worship statues of the emperor and of the Roman gods. But if the Christians persisted in claiming to be Christians, finally he had them executed. But Pliny was surprised by what he learned from his interrogations. It seemed like the strange rumors flying around about Christians weren't really true. Apparently what the Christians did was not some sort of conspiracy against the empire, but instead they just met on a special day, early before the sun had risen, and they made a promise together not to lie, not to steal, and not to commit adultery. And maybe most shocking of all, they would sing a song to Jesus, and they would sing to him as if he was a god. Pliny writes the whole thing off as superstition, but his letter to the emperor is some of the earliest evidence, other than the Bible, for the early Christian belief in the Incarnation. The Incarnation was the idea that somehow this man named Jesus, who had already been executed, was also the ancient God of Israel. The idea of the Incarnation was basically just a bizarre superstition to Pliny, but it's basically second nature to us. We don't even think twice about it. The idea that Jesus is God is one of the first things we learn when we become a Christian. Just a few weeks ago, many of us would have sang Christmas carols about it. Maybe you sang Hark the Herald Angels Sing and sang, Veiled in flesh, the Godhead see, hail the incarnate deity. Or maybe you sang O Come All Ye Faithful, which has word of the Father, now in flesh appearing. It's part of the Christmas story that almost everybody knows forwards and backward, even people outside the church. Everyone knows Christians claim that Jesus is God in the flesh. It's not a coincidence, though, that the Roman governor Pliny asked Christians to pray and worship statues or idols to try and tear them away from this problem. Idol worship was how normal Roman society worked. Roman and Greek cities were full of temples, and each temple belonged to one god or another. And to be a good citizen of a city meant participating in worshiping the gods. Who knows what would happen to you or to the city if you didn't, and the gods became angry at you. Temples to various gods were just a fact of life, both in the ancient Near East, in the time of Moses, all the way through to Jesus' day in the Roman and Greek world. It's strange to us here and now to think about it, but back then, temples were just part of how life worked. In those times, people thought of temples as a place a god lived sometimes, kind of like a house for that god. And all temples at their most inner sacred spot would have a statue, and that statue would look like what people thought that god or goddess looked like. One way of saying that is that the idol would be in the image of that god. And when someone went to the temple to worship or to make a sacrifice, whatever ceremony they did would be towards the idol. Sometimes these statues were life-size, about the size of a person. Sometimes they could be really, really large. Actually, in Nashville, they have a full-scale replica of the Parthenon, which was a huge Greek temple for the goddess Athena. And inside, they've recreated the enormous statue of the goddess that they would have had in that temple back then. And that particular one, I think, is over 40 feet tall. They weren't always that big, but throughout history, every kind of temple had this kind of cult image as its focus, at its center. Every kind of temple was like that, except the Jewish temples. And this is one of the things that made the Jewish temples very, very different. The Desert Tabernacle and the first and second temples in Jerusalem had no statue in it that was supposed to be worshipped. This was completely unique. The Israelites worshipped the only real God, the Creator God. And in the most sacred spot of the tabernacle and the temples, the Holy of Holies, they wouldn't put a statue of God, but they believed that God himself would really meet them there. Idol worship would have been just about everywhere, but they had been forbidden in the law from creating any kind of idol. It was so important that it's the second of the 10 commandments. The first commandment was, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. And then the second was, you shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. But you can see how easy it was to fall back into idol worship back in those days, because when Moses was up on the mountain receiving the rules, those 10 commandments and the law, the people that God had just rescued from Egypt were down below already making new idols. They take gold and they make an image of a calf, and they hold them up saying, these are the gods that really rescued us from Egypt. And when Moses comes back down the mountain, it is a huge disaster for the people. God didn't want people worshiping images. Psalm 135 puts it like this: the idols of the nations are silver and gold, the work of human hands. They have mouths but do not speak. They have eyes but do not see. They have ears but do not hear, nor is there any breath in their mouths. Those who make them become like them, so do all who trust in them. Basically, you become like what you worship, and idols were just lifeless pieces of metal. The person who wrote that psalm thought that if you worshipped a lifeless piece of metal, you would turn into something lifeless too. And even though there's no idol in the desert tabernacle, which was basically like a portable temple tent, the ancient Israelites believed that God was really living with them there, leading them through the wilderness to the promised land. And after settling in the promised land, eventually God's people grow into a powerful kingdom, and King David's son Solomon builds a beautiful temple for the Lord in Jerusalem to replace the tabernacle, so God will live in Jerusalem. When Solomon has finished building his temple to replace the tabernacle, he knows that God isn't going to just be in a single building. And he says, will God really dwell on the earth? Even heaven and the highest heavens cannot contain you, much less this house that I have built. But God does decide to live in the temple. And after a huge dedication ceremony, the priests come out of the temple, and it says, a huge cloud filled the Lord, and the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. God was living in Jerusalem with his people in his temple. But God gives a warning to Solomon. If people turn away from God and worship idols instead, he will leave the temple, and it will mean exile for the people. The people do eventually turn away, and they worship idols of other gods. And sadly, the temple in Jerusalem is destroyed, and the people are taken out of their homeland to Babylon, a complete disaster for God's people. But God, he doesn't forget the promise he made to Abraham. And the books of the prophets reveal a promise of the turn of both the people and God to the promised land. Isaiah 40 has one of the most spectacular promises about God himself returning to Jerusalem. The prophet writes, a voice cries out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill be made low. And uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain. Then the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all people shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. Then Isaiah 52 has this: listen, your sentinels lift up their voices. Together they sing for joy, for in plain sight they see the return of the Lord to Zion. God is going to return to Jerusalem, and everyone there would be able to see it and celebrate. And true to the promises, God's people eventually do return to the land, and they start rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem. But the line of kings, starting with David, didn't exist anymore. And except for one brief period, they weren't in charge of the land anymore. Pagan rulers had taken over. And at the new temple they built in Jerusalem, it isn't recorded anywhere that the glory of the Lord comes back like it had so dramatically on the first temple. But there was hope that the full promise would come true. One day God would return to his temple, and David's kingdom would be restored. In Malachi 3, which was written after the return from exile and the rebuilding of the temple, the writer says, see, I am sending my messenger to prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. People were waiting for God to act, to return to his temple dramatically. And in the gospel stories, we find the earliest Christians saying that God did suddenly come to the temple, but not with fire and smoke. Instead, he came as a person. He came as Jesus. In John's gospel, after the story of Jesus going to the temple and dramatically overturning the tables of the money changers, it says, the Jews then said to him, what sign can you show us for doing this? Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. The Jews said, this temple has been under construction for 46 years, and will you raise it up in 3 days? But he was speaking of the temple of his body. The true temple, the true place God was living was here, and it was Jesus, a human being. One of the most well-known parts of the Bible is the opening of John's Gospel, which starts like this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then its climax comes a few verses later in verse 14, it's actually our Core 52 memory verse this week. It says, "And the Word became flesh and lived among us. We gazed upon his glory, glory like that of the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth." The Word became flesh and lived among us. In Greek, it's ke ho logos sarxagenito, ke eskenosin en hemin. The verb eskenosin literally means pitched his tent. Some translations put it like this: the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. God wasn't using an actual tent or a tabernacle anymore. He was here as a person. And this is what the tabernacle and the temple were always meant to point to, the moment when God would live with his people as a human being. And now we can understand why it doesn't make any sense to create an idol to worship, why it doesn't make sense to make any image of God. In the Genesis 1 creation story, humans are the ones created in the image of God. No lifeless statue could ever represent the Creator, but here is Jesus, the true human being, the true image of God. In his letter to the Colossians, Paul writes, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation." And a few verses later he says, "For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell." This is the great mystery of the Incarnation, that when we look at Jesus, we are looking at the true image of the invisible God. We are looking at what God is really like. If you want to know what God is like, look at Jesus. In John chapter 14, Philip doesn't get it, and he asks Jesus to actually show them God. And Jesus says to him, "Have I been with you all this time, Philip, and you still don't know me? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father." If we look at Jesus, we see God. And what we see is that he's loving, he's full of mercy. We see he loves children and treats them gently. He associates with the poor and social outcasts. He heals the sick, and he even cries when his friends die. And we even find that he was willing to suffer a humiliating death to save us. That's what God is like. And now that we've seen what God is like, there are huge consequences for our lives, because the Spirit of the God, who we now know because we've seen Jesus, is supposed to live inside of us. Jesus talked about himself as the real temple, but in Paul's letter, Paul talks about us as God's temple. One example is 1 Corinthians 3:16, where Paul says, "Don't you see? You are God's temple. God's Spirit lives in you." For Paul, this wasn't just some nice idea he thought up, but it meant a big change for our life. We know what God looks like. We've seen what God's image is. It's time for us to put on a new self that's like the image, to be conformed to it. In Colossians 3, Paul writes, "But now you must get rid of all such things: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and abusive language from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have stripped off the old self with its practices, and have clothed yourselves with the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge according to the image of its Creator." We are being remade according to the image of our Creator. And so things like greed and anger and lying, they don't have any place in our life anymore. In the 4th century, a Christian bishop named Athanasius put it like this. He said, "You know what happens when a portrait that has been painted on a panel becomes ruined because of stains. The artist does not throw away the panel, but the subject of the portrait has to come and sit for it again. And then the likeness is redrawn on the same material. Even so was it with the Holy Son of God. He, the image of the Father, came and dwelt in our midst, in order that he might renew mankind made after himself, the rebirth and recreation of the soul in the image of God." This recreation is what the Roman governor Pliny couldn't understand. How were people turning away from the pagan idols and committing themselves to lives of goodness and purity? Pliny ended his letter to the Emperor Trajan very sure of himself. He tells the emperor that he's sure he has a handle on the problem, and that this new group called Christians was definitely not going anywhere. But within 2 centuries after he sent his letter, the gospel message that Pliny had missed had spread across the entire Roman Empire and beyond. And the Christians that Pliny was torturing and even killing knew that the God who had created the world and was now revealed by Jesus was now at work in them by the Spirit, making them a new creation. May we all be renewed according to God's perfect image in the same way.